as we develop this time, we're going into summer. And summer is a great time for us to take vacations, and that's important. Now, one of the often cliches people say is don't take a vacation from God. And obviously we shouldn't, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't change certain things during summer. And one of the most important things we may do is to develop new habits that draw us closer to Christ and draw us closer to living His way. One of the best things you can do is to do some good spiritual reading. And there's plenty of good spiritual reading out there. I always recommend reading the saints. Now, there are plenty of saints that have some good writings, and we have 2,000 years of the saints, everywhere from the Gospel in the New Testament, all the way up to some of the writings of some of the newest saints. Now, one of the important things to understand is that when we're reading the saints, we have to have a good understanding of to whom they were writing and make a difference and differentiate between to whom they're writing and whether or not we can live that. Because many of the saints wrote to people in monasteries. And obviously, if you're working in the world, you cannot live the rule of a monastery. You cannot live with a family and say, I am not going to make any kind of talk at all for the next day, because it's going to drive everyone nuts. As a matter of fact, one of the saints warns against that. But what you can do is that you can find what applies to you and to live that. Now, let me give you an example. A lot of people will connect the saints with some very strong fire and brimstone preaching. Take, for example, St. Alphonsus Liguori. I don't think there are any saints out there who can preach with fire and brimstone as well as St. Alphonsus Liguori. But if you read carefully what he's writing to people who have either drifted away from Christ or are trying to turn back to Christ. And so he can be very harsh in his writings. But for those who seek to live the gospel and are trying to live the gospel and maybe fail, he gives a really great teaching on the mercy of God. And he says, now obviously he encourages confession, but one of the things he says is that if you fall in sin, it's important for you to ask God for forgiveness and to trust in that. And obviously it's important to go to confession. But here's the thing that's important. He says, anything beyond that, if you find yourself, especially in the summer when there's a lot of free time, just lost and worried about whether or not God has forgiven you, he explains, St. Alphonsus Liguori says, that's not from God, and to turn away from that. So it's calling to trust in God's mercy. As a matter of fact, one of the important roles of the sacrament of confession, which summer is a great time to make regular confession too. One of the important roles of the sacrament of confession is to remind you that you are forgiven. Because once you receive the words of absolution, if you're turning around and not forgiving yourself, you can easily say to yourself, God has forgiven me, what right do I have not to forgive myself? So these are important times to do some good spiritual reading, and there's tons of it out there. One of my favorite writers is St. Teresa of Avila. Now, there's something interesting about St. Teresa of Avila. I told you she's writing, a lot of the saints are writing to monasteries and whatnot. Now, St. Teresa of Avila was a Carmelite. She actually restored parts of the Carmelite order in her writing and her holiness out of Avila in Spain. But the operative pronoun when you're reading St. Teresa of Avila is she, not he, because she's writing to women. So it's a rather fascinating thing as you're reading that and seeing that the operative pronoun, at least in English, is she. She has some powerful, very great things to say. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite sayings, because you will often hear of the great saints having these great experiences of mysticism and these great experiences of miracles, and she says, not to, I don't know if I have the wording right, not to be envious of those who have what she called encouragements, which were mystical experiences and even experiences of miracles. Not to be envious of those who have encouragements, for they suffer. they really suffer. So you can see that you can find yourself saying, oh, I wish I could be like Saint so-and-so who could see Jesus everywhere, but that's not your call, and you can rest assured what may not be in the writing is Saint so-and-so, whoever it might be, also suffered greatly. You have a whole different way of looking at how you live your life when you read the writings of the saints, understanding that which you can follow and that which you cannot, depending on your way of life, which is always good to bring it up with a spiritual advisor. And when you do that, summer is a great time to do that. So I'm going to encourage you to read the writings of the saints, some of your latest saints if you want, some of the earlier saints. The New Testament, of course, is the writings of St. Paul and St. John and St. Peter, to say nothing of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Stay away from the book of Revelation for right now, because it can be very confusing, except for the letters to the churches. But other than that, read the writings of the saints. And you may also want to consider reading the encyclicals. One of the great things of having the internet is you can go on the Vatican website, vatican.va, actually www.vatican.va. You have to have the www or it won't work. And you go find the English version of the website, and you can click on any of the popes and read some of their encyclicals, and they have powerful words. And of course, another great person to read, although you may need some help from someone who has studied philosophy, if you don't know philosophy, is the person who is behind me, St. Thomas Aquinas. Whatever the case may be, enjoy reading during the summer, during your downtime. You can only have to read a chapter. A lot of these books are written with very short chapters. And just think about them, underline them, whatever the case may be. But continue your spiritual life by going to church at least once a week, and by praying every day. And maybe if you have some downtime, do some spiritual reading and talk with a spiritual advisor and make your summer spiritually fruitful for Christ. God bless you.